Hello and welcome. My name is Joe Caramelli, and I oversee Grand Rounds for the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And thank you for joining today's Grand Rounds presentation. Now, I want to just mention a few things. One, there's a core group of us that work on Grand Rounds each week, including Samhara Braha on coordination and communications, and Mike Walker on technology. Now, we record all the Grand Rounds presentations. We put them on the department website under the Grand Rounds section. So you could watch prior presentations or today's presentation sometime in the future. You can submit questions during the presentation in either the chat or the Q&A part, and I'll collect those questions and can go through those with the presenters at the end. Close to the end of the presentation, I'll put a Grand Rounds presentation evaluation link in the chat. It's 5 questions. Please consider filling that out. It's helpful for me in planning Grand Rounds and in communicating with presenters. So I want to get to talking about today's presentation right away. We do have 3 presenters for today. It's a timely topic, and I want to talk a little bit about this. So for today, we have a group presenting, a faculty member in our department, Dr. Eric Bruns, along with Dr. Tona McGuire and Dr. Kira Mosseth. And Dr. McGuire and Dr. Mosseth co-lead the Washington State Department of Health Behavioral Health Strike Team. And you'll hear about that today in greater detail, and a little bit about each presenter. Briefly, Dr. McGuire is a clinical psychologist working primarily with children and families. And I recently learned had previously worked quite extensively on the consultation and liaison service and division at Seattle Children's Hospital. And Dr. McGuire has been involved in disaster preparation and response for over 16 years, locally and internationally. Dr. Mosseth is a practicing clinical psychologist seeing patients at the Snohomish Psychology Associates in Everett and Edmonds, and is a senior instructor at Seattle University, and has worked abroad extensively with disaster survivors and refugees and trained first responders in such settings. And finally, Dr. Eric Bruns, professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at UW, and a mental health services researcher and associate director of the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center. And Dr. Bruns works on research and care coordination models, school mental health, and public sector implementation of research-based practices. I want to say this group of presenters also wrote and co-authored an editorial that was published in the Seattle Times, summarizing a little bit about their work. I think we'll hear more extensively about that today. And I'll turn it over initially to Dr. Bruns.
Thanks so much, Joe. Am I showing the right screen, and can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, and this is the presenter screen, not the single slide screen.
All right, let me switch. Hold on one second. Okay, how's that? Is that better?
Unchanged.
Unchanged, oh. Strange. Let me stop sharing. Sorry about that. Hold on one second. I don't know why. Sometimes these things are a little bit beyond me. So I'll probably have to switch this again. Do I need to switch, or is that right?
It's the same presenter mode. There it is. Okay.
All right. So now that we got that sorted out, it's my true honor to be presenting with 2 colleagues that I've grown pretty close to in the last few months. So, you know, Joe was just saying that Dr. McGuire has been doing international behavioral health relief work for 16 years. For myself, it's been about 16 weeks. Certainly have, as a clinical psychologist, intervened with a lot of kids and families about their own individual crises and so forth. But it was only in February, after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, that I got engaged in this. And this is, my role is just going to be to set up the story for Tona and Kira to talk about the real topic here, which is methods of training first responders to be effective in the context of things like natural disasters, war, and so forth. So Exactly 3 months ago today, on February 27th, 3 days after the invasion of Ukraine, I received an email from a colleague of mine in Poland, a psychologist and a university professor, who I'll introduce in a second, requesting help for the first responders in his country. And it was 1 month later, just about to the day, that this photo on this title slide here was taken with the three of us and two colleagues training a whole bunch of folks in the city of Lublin, Poland, in the basement of a 17th century monastery. So just thinking about all the history that must have taken place in this building that then now serves as the cultural center for the city of Lublin is just something that was, remarkable in and of itself as an American to kind of reflect on. So we're about an hour from the 330-mile border between Ukraine and Poland doing that work. As the recipient of that first call for help, I'll just be setting the stage for the real stars of the show today here, which are Tona and Kira, who will provide an overview of disaster behavioral health response and the health support team model that they have developed to effectively intervene in these kinds of crises and disasters. And I'll come back and summarize and wrap up with a little bit of what some other members of the team, myself and my colleague, Dr. Sharon Hoover, added with respect to educators and teachers that we provided training for in Poland to be effective responders to the needs of students who were being absorbed into Polish schools, and a little bit about data that we've collected on evaluating our impact. So here's our friend, Dr. Robert Porzak from the University of Economics and Innovation in Lublin, Poland. And he, along with representatives of about 14 countries internationally, globally, are part of a group called the School Mental Health International Leadership Exchange. And SMILE, as we call ourselves, gets together monthly by Zoom and shares ideas about how to support students' mental wellness in the school context. And we also get together, COVID we did, and never, we often debate, like, what is the role that this group can actually play in supporting one another? And never has that become so clear how important it is to have groups like this, as on February 27th, when I got this email from Robert. This is 2 days after the invasion, essentially, 3 days perhaps. Hundreds of thousands of war refugees, mostly women and children, are arriving in Hungary, Poland, Romania, and other countries. We are trying to help. If you have colleagues who have content for supporting children and their parents, please let me know. And thus began this journey. So I referred Robert to Kira and Tona, and they'll be explaining very shortly why that's the case. I'd been working with them on COVID behavioral health relief in schools here in Washington State, and so I'd begun to know their work well. And the fact that it emerged from international contexts, made it just a no-brainer to connect them. And so within a few weeks, we were assembling a team that included Kira and Tona, and also the director of the National Center for School Mental Health, because of the interest in training educators among first responders and working with school administrators at the national and local levels in Poland to aid in schools' response to the students that were coming into their schools. Robin Smith, a therapist who has been working with Kira and Tona has amazing contacts in Central and Eastern Europe, was a huge part of this effort. They'll tell a little bit about the translation efforts that went into this, and she coordinated so many of them. And Jeff Bostic from Georgetown University, a colleague of Dr. Hoover, came over as well. So this was our team. And the context, just real quickly, many of you probably have seen these statistics, that 14 million Ukrainians have been displaced by this horrible war, and 6 million of them have crossed into other countries. And Poland has taken in by far the majority of these refugees, 3.5 million estimated by the UN as of a few days ago. So the need that Dr. Horzak anticipated certainly came to fruition. And so here's Poland, you know, about the size of France, one of the largest countries in Europe, 330-mile border with Ukraine. And these are the places that we spent our time. In London, where Roberts University is, and where he had, and which was also a place where many refugees were gathering because of the proximity to the border. And a lot of these folks, as we learned, wanted to stay close to the border, presuming that they would be returning home as soon as possible. But we also then went to Warsaw to work with schools. This is where Dr. Hoover and I planned to spend spend time with Dr. Bostic and Robin as well, to do additional trainings more focused on the school context. So just a little bit of where we were and the number of trainings we did. Typically 2 to 3 trainings, 4 hours each a day for about 10 days. So here we are at SeaTac, taking off, and who did we meet along the way right as we landed? If folks recognize that plane, that was on the tarmac when we hit it, and that's Air Force One. So Joe Biden was there with us as we landed in Poland at that time. So a couple more pictures, and I'll hand it over to Tona and Kira. Here we are as a team. I was taking the pictures, I'm not in there, in front of Caritas, essentially Catholic Church-run Red Cross of Poland. And you can see there underneath the castle. This was not a war zone, right? We were close to the border, but this was a beautiful, picturesque university town. But this is the staging place for so much of the relief that was going on. And as we learned, behind so many walls and doors and in so many buildings in this city and others in Poland, there were folks who had experienced the horrors of this war, seeking solace with the help of the Polish people. So last couple pictures. Here is one of our hosts in one of the refugee centers that we worked, Arik, can't remember his last name, showing us one of the dormitories of what usually is a summer camp that had been turned into a refugee center. And so it is here that we worked with both the relief workers there, the refugee center workers, and Ukrainian toys and stuffies piled up that had been donated. And this van was one of the first things we encountered on our first visit to our first refugee center. And we pulled up in early morning on the second day we were there and saw Ukrainian language written on the back, and Robin started laughing. She could read what it said. What it said was, "Putin is a dickhead." So with that, we also saw some much more wonderful and beautiful things, such as all of the art that the refugee center volunteers and workers had done with these many Ukrainian children that were staying in their center. And this was just heartbreaking and beautiful to see all over the walls of this center. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kira and Tona to talk about the real topic here, which is what are the basics of disaster behavioral health response and the HST model.
Thanks, Eric. So this is a modified graph from an original SAMHSA graph looking at the phases of disasters of all types. It doesn't really matter. And the correlation with behavioral health impact. And our team with Department of Health have had to modify this because of COVID. And so you can see, impacts and those kinds of things. But what I would say is that when we went to Poland, the Polish people and the Ukrainian folks who were displaced were pretty much at that honeymoon heroic phase. There was a lot of media attention. It was early on in the disaster. What we were hearing was what we actually heard early in the Syrian war when we were in Jordan, which is we're just going to be here for a little while and then we're going to head on home. There's a lot of social cohesion. The behavioral health impact is actually within the community not that bad. But from there, in every disaster, we kind of slide down into this long, awful disillusionment phase. And that's when the behavioral health impacts come out. And we anticipate for Poland and Ukraine, the worst of this is likely to start appearing towards the end of summer and in the fall, when everybody is exhausted, it's not done, they can't see a way out. And this is when we start to see real increases in depression, anxiety, suicide rates go up. We tried to share a little bit of that out when we were there training, but it's hard because they were already tired. And we would get this kind of deer in the headlights look when we started talking about, and in the future. But just keeping in mind that, as we go through various phases of any type of disaster, there are pretty specific behavioral health impacts that go along with that. Next slide, please. So in any disaster, in any critical event, there is often what we call catastrophic degradation. And this photograph is a perfect example of catastrophic degradation in terms of infrastructure. But it also happens in healthcare as well. Next slide, please. And here's an analogy from emergency medicine. We used this 7 years ago, probably in grand rounds at Seattle Children's Hospital. When you have 1 or 2 casualties, you go to the trauma center in your community and you get the best of care. And when you have 20 severe casualties, as was probably the situation down in Uvalde, not everybody gets the trauma surgeon and the full trauma team. The surge of patients is so extreme that you just have to sort of manage as best you can. And you can try to plan for this, but you're going to hit a wall. Next slide, please. And so what we want to hope for, what we want to plan for, is graceful degradation of care. We anticipate that the need is going to overwhelm the resources. And when we're talking about behavioral health, we want to adapt kind of a graceful degradation of care model as well. Next slide, please. And so when you don't have enough providers and when you have way too many patients, what do you do? And so this is where the health support team model comes in, and this is why we developed it. Kira and I went to Haiti right after the earthquake for the first time, not too long after, and we were the only 2 behavioral health providers in this little field clinic that was set up outside of Port-au-Prince. 200 patients a day, and it quickly became evident that of those 200 patients, a huge majority of them were struggling with acute stress symptoms related to the earthquake, and that the interventions that we kind of had on hand, such as psychological first aid, were not going to hold. And so psychological first aid, which many of you may have heard about, is really first line few days into a disaster. And it's all about having a place to be that's safe, and access to food and water, reconnecting people if they've been separated, and a really quick and dirty evaluation for psychiatric emergencies. Are you homicidal? Are you suicidal? Are you psychotic? But there's so much more that goes on. And so our idea was to kind of fill that gap with a more in-depth behavioral health curriculum, to take what we know as psychologists, simplify it, and train it out to the community, because they're the ones on the front lines. Next slide, please. And so these are the modules for the health support team. Now, we have trained this out to all ages and all educational levels from high school on up. And the 4 modules are to become an excellent listener, so that you can learn about whatever it is that's troubling the people that you're working with. To offer support in a way that's healthy for the supporter and the person receiving the support, providing tools to manage those acute stress responses, not letting people dither with symptoms of anxiety and depression without offering them some ways of mitigating that before they can potentially get into care. And then emphasizing hope. And that's not a Pollyanna, it's all going to be hunky-dory, but really helping the community members understand that there is a path forward. There is things will get better in some regards, and that there is hope for the future. So these are the key elements, and these are the things that we teach out to the people within the community. Next slide, please. So this is the program. And what we have done is take all the evidence-based tools that we are aware of, most come out of cognitive behavioral therapy, and teach those out. We do psychoeducation on what happens when someone is going through a disaster of any kind. We've been doing this across Washington State in the last couple of years as well. And it's very calming and resilience building. What we hear from people when we talk about, when you go through a disaster, it's this, is, oh my gosh, I thought I was going crazy. I thought I had early onset dementia. And so we try to teach people about what happens during a disaster, the phases of disaster, how we recover, the skills and techniques. And a lot of that is communication and listening. And that's the area where we get the most pushback. When we're training active listening, supportive listening, our trainees will often say, I don't feel like I'm doing anything. And we have to then emphasize the fact that this supportive listening, active listening, without trying to solve the problem for the other person, is an incredibly powerful tool. Then we work on factors that go into resiliency, how to get ready for the next disaster. And then those tools that I mentioned, relaxation, mindfulness, behavioral activation, cognitive strategies, regulated breathing, all the things that you guys probably know and practice in your own jobs as well. And then self-care for the health support team members so that people don't burn themselves out. And it's so difficult to do that. People who are helpers, and when the need is so great, just want to help and help and help and help. And so we work a lot on effective boundaries, how to say no, how to draw the line so that they have the energy and the wherewithal to kind of continue to go forward. Next slide, please. So there, when you go to another country, there are obviously international issues. And I have a good friend who is an emergency physician and a member of a DMAT team. So she gets deployed all over the place in the country. And her saying is, I don't want anybody on my DMAT team who wouldn't be comfortable camping in a primitive environment. So if you're going to go out and throw yourself into the fray, it's really helpful to be flexible, to make plans and expect that those plans are going to change. Get used to the fact that you're not going to do things the way that you normally would do them. And it's these kinds of issues, even in the United States, that we run into with our colleagues. This is not the time to do trauma therapy. This is actually not the time to do therapy. And that is a very difficult adjustment for some people. But what we're really about in disaster behavioral health is those early interventions of support and tools and recognizing when someone is in crisis so that we can prepare a little space within the system, which is overwhelmed with patients. So learning to work with translators, learning to be uncomfortable, being prepared enough personally that you aren't a burden on the system. So the expectation being you're going to take care of yourself. You're going to figure out where you're going to stay, going to figure out your food. You're not going to be one of the people that other people on the ground have to help. Next slide, please. And then, working in any sort of culture, learning the nuances of that culture, learning the differences linguistically, culturally, whatever those are, and just going with those, not trying to push against those. So working with translators, for example, when we were in Haiti, we were working with translators all the time. And I had learned working with translators in a hospital setting, not to talk to the translator, but to talk to the patient and let the translator work. When we did that in Haiti, the translators were extremely offended. I'm not a radio. You tell me what you want to convey and I will convey it to them. So just getting used to that kind of pushback. But within all of this, the whole goal of the health support team training is to train up community members in what we know to be evidence-based disaster behavioral health principles, and then turn them loose. That allows them to adapt the training so that it's culturally relevant, it's linguistically relevant, And it's more sustainable because it doesn't rely on people like us flying over, experts flying over and flying over and flying over. It becomes embedded within the community itself. And that's the way we want it to be. Next slide, please. So this, if you can do basic behavioral health intervention sitting on a stool under a tent with a lot of frantic people, a lot of noise, no real expectation of privacy, that's what you're up against. In Poland, it was a little different because unlike in Jordan and in Haiti, as Eric mentioned, they weren't in these camps. They had been absorbed into Polish homes for the most part, which was the most amazing and generous thing I think I've ever seen. But nevertheless, when you're working within a monastery, working with the staff of the priory and Caritas, teaching monks and nuns, or you're shifting over to a small community center, all of that requires that you just have to be nimble on your feet and not get stuck on how you think it ought to go. Next slide, please. So this is what's happened over the years since our earthquake in Haiti experience. We've trained there. We went to Jordan a number of times, worked with NGO workers and refugees from the Syrian war. In Poland, trained a lot of people, some just community members and some who were crisis workers. But my sense of things in Poland was that really everybody in the country at the point we were there was functioning as a disaster responder. It was such an influx of new people coming in that everybody's jobs got changed a little bit. So the ladies in the museums who did things for the kids, they had to adapt to providing interventions for Ukrainian children. The crisis managers had to adapt to people who had just been through an extraordinarily complex and crisis-laden situation. And same here in the United States when we've trained Medical Reserve Corps members, CERT members, physicians, nurses, first responders, all of that. It changes every time. Next slide, please. So we have some specific adaptations. We have just gotten back from the graphic designer, the newest version of our child and teen manual. We started that actually in Haiti for educators, but it's really for any adults, parents, caregivers, educators, coaches who work with kids, and it applies those basic health support team principles, but with some specific material for youth, developmentally appropriate kinds of things, so that we can, again, support the youngest of us in these impacted communities. And then next slide, please. And then we have one for medical clinics, staff wellness, trauma informed care for children and adults, sort of the special circumstances that arise when you are an exhausted physician or nurse and you're in this field clinic and people are coming at you all the time and you're an easy target to be mad at. So those materials got adapted as well. I think that's the end of my section. I think I'm going to turn it over to Kira to kind of move forward from here.
Thanks, Tona. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the content that the HST program includes. This is a picture of some of the work that we did at a Caritas site outside of Lublin, actually, at the summer camp that was converted that Eric had mentioned previously. This is a translator that we were working with who's speaking to a group of Ukrainian mothers. And these are all moms who are there with their children. And most of them had husbands or brothers or siblings who had remained behind in Ukraine to stay and fight, as was required and is still required. And they were trying to navigate the complexity of having the burden of their family, typically more than one kid, with them on their own in a foreign country. Usually language is a barrier. And the exciting part about this type of program where we're offering this information to these moms in this context is that they can choose to do with it what they will. And I think one of the things that we've heard and been asked quite frequently is, these are people who are traumatized themselves, they're already refugees. Is this overburdensome to give them this information? And we actually did a little bit of data collection about that in Haiti. And it might not be surprising, I suppose, but one of the great findings about that is that when people are empowered to support other people, they have a piece of information that's going to help their neighbor or their friend who is a refugee with them. It actually tends to increase their personal sense of resilience. It tends to reinforce their sense of purpose. It's a little bit motivating to feel like you have some tools that you know what to do with and can use effectively. So just being able to put the information in the hands of people who can apply it within their communities is a pretty rewarding experience, I have to say. This picture is interesting to me too, because at one point, very, very close to this, our translator turned to me and he said, "That's not a good example here." And I was using an example of how when someone is going through panic or anxiety, that using ice, like sucking on an ice cube or putting your hands in ice water is a good way to calm the sympathetic nervous system. And he looked at me and he was like, "That you don't want to use that example here because ice is not a good thing. Like that cold and snow and ice is not, that's not a calming thing culturally from a cultural perspective." He's Ukrainian, our translator who we were working with. And that was a piece of information that was completely unknown to me at the time. And I said, "Okay, well, don't mention that." And he said, "I have a different idea. Can I use that?" And he went ahead and adapted that piece of the tool training that we were providing at that time in a culturally appropriate way. And so making the information that's clinically and sort of scientifically supported, but adjust it in a culturally relevant and appropriate way is something that we really relish the opportunity to do in the hands of translators and hosts and people that we're training and working with. So that's kind of the way that that process looks ideally. Next slide, please. I'm just going to go quickly through some examples of content. We do talk a lot about the brain science because, just like Tona was mentioning earlier, having that information really does tend to put people at ease by recognizing that there's not something wrong with them specifically. We don't talk about this very much, and so unless you really recognize this is a widespread phenomenon, you might think there's something wrong with you or happening just to you, and not recognizing how sort of universal these experiences are. So depending on the audience, sometimes we go more in depth into the neuroscience and sometimes we just talk about it kind of superficially, but we always include a piece of it. Next slide, please. It's also really helpful, especially when we're working with parents, caregivers, and teachers, to talk about normal reflections and expressions of trauma responses. A lot of times when parents are struggling with aggressive behavior or what they consider out of character behavior on the part of their kids, they're not understanding what the context is for that and really where that's coming from, but they're just getting frustrated. And when they have context for understanding that those developmental regressions and some of that behavior is part of children's way of processing trauma and processing fear, it really gives them perspective to interact with their children or the people, the kids for whom they're caring in a different way. So we like to include that background as well. Next slide, please. We try to emphasize, across groups that resilience is the most common population level outcome for any type of disaster or critical incident. It might take longer than we want. It might be a rough road getting there sometimes, but that is the population common outcome. People are incredibly strong and incredibly resilient, and we have lots of data to back that up. And the other cool thing that we like to put in folks' hands is the idea that resilience isn't something that you either have or you don't have. I've joked with Tona many times that there's no junior woodchuck merit badge for resilience. You don't just get it and then you're done. It's an ongoing process. And as such, it is something that people are capable of developing. So we talk about what the ingredients are for resilience and how to go about slowly trying to increase those things on a daily basis. Next slide, please. This is an example of some of the translated material. I'm going to talk about translation in a minute, but we basically try to provide the same information that we do in our English guide, just back to back with a Polish and Ukrainian version, depending on the audience that we were working with. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the translation. We've typically struggled getting things translated when we do international work. Our training curriculum is about 60 to 70 pages long in English. And we have a train the trainer guide, a basic guide, the child and teen version of the thing. And we also had a few different other psychological triage guides that we were also using on this trip. Eric's going to talk a little bit about some of those in a minute, but the bottom line is that Robin, one of our team members that we were mentioning earlier, really helped sort of facilitate getting us connected with several different groups all over the United States and in Europe who were volunteering to help out. And there was an AI program that was part of this unit, and they would run all of our materials through this AI program, and then it would be sort of certified and double checked by native speakers. And we got over 1,000 pages of text done in less than 3 weeks, which was lightning fast compared to any of our previous attempts at getting things translated when we worked in other places. So lots of volunteers from all over the world contributed their time and effort to make this happen. Next slide, please. These are just those 4 ingredients of resilience that we talk about a little bit. I don't know what to mention specifically here besides the fact that usually there's something about this section of the training that really resonates fairly deeply with people. But it's also important to recognize that even though all 4 of them can be grown intentionally and increased intentionally, hope is the one that tends to be the most influenced by social and cultural experience. So depending on people's internalized and cultural experience of marginalization, regardless of where you are in the world, right? Discrimination or racism, hope is the one that tends to be the most challenging sometimes. And when people are in crisis in a disaster, it's the hardest one to access sometimes. It's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But it's not about being optimistic and overly positive. It's about being more realistic about that path forward that Tona was mentioning. Next slide, please. We like to really emphasize, boy, has this become incredibly relevant in recent days too, but what do kids need to recover? And putting this information in the hands of teenagers and adults and anyone who's a caregiver or an educator, these are the things, right? This is the handful of things. And then our manual and our training breaks down how to go about doing this in a little bit more detail. So providing answers, being honest with kids, establishing a sense of routine. When there's a disaster or an incident, everything is upended. And so really getting back into a routine that kids can predict what's going to happen is very settling and helpful for them. And then also thinking about what I am empowered to do. What does my future look like? What are my options? And that sense of empowerment being grounding for them. It is very hard for adults to provide this net for children when we ourselves are struggling with these things. And as I mentioned, lately, especially, it's hard to sort of facilitate this this safety net for our kids when we might be struggling with these things too. And the same is absolutely the case consistently in a disaster or in a refugee context. But once you know what they are, you can work on sort of tiptoeing towards building up these elements for you as an adult and as a caregiver, as well as for the kids that you're supporting. Next slide, please. Okay, the increasing communication and the active listening, I'm just gonna go ahead and skip this one, Eric, and go to the next one. Tona was mentioning that active listening is the hardest thing, that when we're teaching, it feels like you're not doing much, but it really is the #1 5-star recommendation in terms of training content that we try to emphasize. A good type of communication where the speaker feels supported and understood by the listener is going to go farther towards behavioral health recovery than any kind of problem solving after that initial 48 hours. So on the heels of psychological first aid, the way that recovery really gets going in terms of any kind of movement is through this process of processing and active listening. Not therapy, right? It's a piece of that. It's a piece of communication, but this is a style that anyone can engage in. Next slide, please. These are just additional types of interventions. I'm just going to list a couple of them. We always take bubbles when we do international work, teaching parents and kids how to regulate breathing, engage the parasympathetic nervous system. The kids' version of progressive muscle relaxation, where you have them scrunch up like a pill bug or a roly-poly, depending. They have them pretty much everywhere in the world, depending on where you are. There's a different name for it. But you have them scrunch up and hold their muscles really tight and then flop and let go. And that's a sort of a kid's version of progressive muscle relaxation. So we teach those skills to parents as well. Next slide, please. Tactical breathing is what we call it because sometimes just breathing techniques don't sound quite cool enough. But tactical breathing is sometimes the term that lands well with folks. So we teach, just regulated sort of that biofeedback and regulatory system control that's helpful for people. Next slide, please. This is an example of bubbles, teaching the bubble breathing to the kids and teaching it to the parents via the kids. And I'm going to turn it back over to Eric to talk about the school-based intervention work that was done with our team as well.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's worth pointing out this is Dr. Sharon Hoover down on the floor. Not only is bubble breathing an effective method of engaging the parasympathetic nervous system and helping calm kids of any ages, but it was a really wonderful kind of experience to be able to have those bubbles around, and lots of other toys that Kira and Tona and others brought to share with the kids and the moms that we interacted with. So just bringing it home a little bit, the HS, it was a very interesting process. Like Tona was saying earlier, I learned by being with these experts that being flexible and able to just be there, ready to meet needs, whatever it takes, being up till 1 a.m. the night before a training that you're invited to do or that you learn the context of, was critical to being, effective. And I think that the evaluation data that we got and then just the general response we got suggests that training these responders, hopefully who are also going off and training others, was effective. But one of the things we did to adapt was we essentially would squish together for educators and teachers that we were working with in some of these 20+ training sessions over 10 days, putting materials specific to the school response. So a couple of the things are a couple of different frameworks for using the multi-tiered systems of support that have been applied to welcoming newcomer youth and refugees and immigrants in other countries. Again, something that our School Mental Health International Leadership Exchange really allowed us to know how to access for the purposes of this trip to Poland. Elements of trauma-informed schools, which again, people have referenced this, sadly is going to be something that's going to be needed in Uvalde and beyond until we find a way to address the extraordinary amount of gun violence that this country is experiencing, and communities continue to suffer those events. And then finally, something that showed really good alignment with the HST model, which is suicide prevention content from something from Forefront Suicide Prevention and my colleague, Dr. Jen Stuber, called Asking is Caring. Blending all of these aspects from training to training was something that the team, learned how to do together over the course of, a week and a half plus together. So just a little note about the school response. Dr. Porzak, kind of gave us some of the stats after we came back. Approximately 186,000 Ukrainian students in Polish schools, 540,000 doing distance learning while in Poland back to their schools in Ukraine, or maybe with teachers who have also left the country. And the message from Dr. Porzak around what was needed sounds pretty similar to our things we hear in our School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center, or SMART Center, every day, that we need more systematic psychological support and integration into Polish schools, especially in light of this crisis. And it's very locally dependent how much fluency and teamwork currently exists in schools around being able to provide that effective response. So as we do in this country, we came equipped with relevant application of the multi-tiered systems of supports that are increasingly being adopted in schools for both academics as well as mental, emotional, and behavioral wellness of kids. And this is shows great alignment with the public health model. And in our view, schools are the place where the public health model is probably best able to be mobilized for children and youth, whereby we have Tier 1 promote strategies to promote positive social, emotional, and behavioral skills for all students. We screen and identify kids who might need early intervention, group-based intervention, brief interventions, triage, do other kinds of supports in these settings and with these community partners that surround the school in the community. And then finally, specific targeted interventions for students with serious concerns. And what Dr. Hoover, with another colleague, Dr. Claire Crooks from Western University in Ontario, Canada, have a model or framework called Newcomer MTSS for refugees and immigrants. So it applies that kind of concept to a set of strategies at each one of those tiers with the mnemonic welcome. So a tier 1 is about welcoming and well-being for all newcomer students. Super applicable to what the Polish schools are now going through with all of these new arrivals from Ukraine. At tier 2, coping and resilience skills, perhaps in group settings for students who need this as they transition to a new school. And finding ways to mend at tier 3, so teaching mental health interventions, which can be learned by school employed folks like counselors and so forth, or it can be delivered by community mental health providers working in partnership with schools, and having screening and triage strategies along the way to make this happen. So this is all encapsulated in a intervention called Supporting Transition Resilience of Newcomer Groups, or STRONG, which has been really, again, pioneered by Dr. Hoover at the National Center for School Mental Health and a couple of other colleagues. And this is something that's likely to be a legacy of our trip, is that having established some of these connections in Warsaw with the Ministry of Education and with some local school districts, it looks as though STRONG is going to be something that's brought over and trained in schools this August and September in anticipation of the new school year, as many of these Ukrainian students are still going to be in schools in Poland. A second piece that we incorporated into some of our trainings were materials from the National Center, National Traumatic Stress Center, and the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center for Resiliency, Hope and Wellness in Schools. And this is about creating a trauma-informed climate. You know, we heard these stories when we were there that were just, just horrible things that these kids and their moms had experienced in getting out of Ukraine into Poland, that they experienced back in their home cities and towns. And so helping the educators think about how to create a trauma-informed climate for students who may be suffering sequelae of trauma was really, really well received by the educators we worked with. So again, the alignment between these different frameworks and models is really quite consistent. So like Kira was saying, transparency and predictability, huge things. So posting schedules all around the school and rooms, attending to the classroom layout, right? Some students may feel very anxious if their backs are to a door. Thinking about the content that might be around your classroom that could be triggering for students who have, experienced trauma in their flight from their home country. Thinking about external stimuli, imagine how this is again going to affect the students in schools and young people in Uvalde and elsewhere, but certainly these students from Ukraine may be suffering reactivity as well, and so being aware of how external stimuli may affect them and other students. A calm corner, setting one up and giving examples of how that might look. So all of these things were part of the school edition that we did. And then just really quick, lastly, we incorporated content for all of the trainees, whether they're city workers, librarians, psychologists, educators, teachers, around being aware of the elevated risk of suicide, especially as that disillusionment phase, which may very well also correspond to, cold, dark weather setting in, this fall. Those will align. And so giving them a mnemonic and a set of strategies to, from the Asking is Caring program, from Forefront Suicide Prevention, to look, steps to look for risk factors and warning signs. Again, alignment with HST. Strategies for active listening and listening gently and empathetically as the first step and most important step to helping a person feel connected to others and reduce the likelihood that that their desperation may lead them to self-harm. Steps to care for the person and take practical steps to prevent suicide, and then connecting the person to help. This is the these are the elements of the Asking is Caring program that we also incorporated into some of our trainings. Don't have time to go into it right now, but again, each one of those steps had some specific amount of content that we would deliver. What are the risk factors and warning signs to be looking for? Again, listening with empathy, do not try to problem solve. We would have folks practice saying some of these things in case they needed to use them with someone who is feeling desperate, someone who is feeling suicidal. And the biggest message, whether it's in Poland or in Walla Walla or Richland schools where we're doing Asking is Caring, making sure that parents, teachers, first responders of all types understand that you need to ask directly about suicide if you're worried that someone is considering suicide. Being direct, identifying the warning signs you notice, and remembering and recognizing that asking is not going to increase the risk of suicide. So we would practice folks saying these questions direct in the session so that they would be prepared to be able to do so if they needed to in their schools and in their community. So, and then finally, in terms of caring, giving tips for practical steps for suicide prevention if an individual was actively suicidal or in crisis. So I'll wrap up just by saying we're trying to evaluate the impact of this work. Again, like Tona and Kira were saying, the idea here is to give folks tools they can use directly with individuals who are seeking refuge from Ukraine, but also to have materials that they can use to train others so that it can be something that can be taken to scale to some extent. These tools can be taken to scale. So, you know, we got 170 responses from some targeted sessions we did, not with mothers and Ukrainian mothers, but with the first responders and educators, and compared the responses using a standardized measure we use at the SMART Center. So we were able to compare the ratings to similar trainings that have been done here in the United States, and found comparable, if not much higher, scores for training interest, trainer competence, and so forth. But more importantly, we saw in these purple bars a real that the responders that we trained came in with a lower level of pre-training mastery around these concepts, knowledge of the typical reactions to disaster, ability to use those communication and active listening techniques. We asked them, you know, about those 4 elements that Tona was talking about, and before the trainings, they rated their mastery as relatively lower than we see in trainings here in the United States on other models. And at the end of the trainings, their ratings were higher. So that was encouraging. One thing that kind of indicated a place where potential improvement might be is those 4 steps of HST, seeing and hearing, offering support, providing a tool such as a technique for relaxation or examining one's thoughts around their situation, relatively lower than the other 3. So it's something to recognize that when you're crunching all of this information into a 4-hour training, finding ways to make sure that these folks feel equipped to actually take that step of providing a tool based on evidence for what works in these kinds of situations, perhaps may require a bit more attention. So I will wrap up, and Joe, feel free to come back on, and if there's any Q's and A's from yourself or anyone else, just the last couple of photos. We had took many photos along the way. We could just do a slideshow if we wanted to, and probably tell the story just as well as all these PowerPoint bullets and so forth. But here's one of our groups from Caritas, a number of friars and nuns among the trainees. Here's our training in the monastery, which was mostly with city workers and psychologists and social workers. A couple other photos. Yeah, so Joe, anything to wrap up? Any questions?
Well, thank you very much for this group presentation covering major domains, hearing about the background work, what the training involved, showing aspects of the training, data from the training, impact, expected impact, and so on. Very, very interesting, informative. I appreciate the breadth of this. I want to encourage any participants, if you have questions or comments, we have a couple of minutes only, but enough for a few questions. I'm wondering if we might start off with a question about resilience. I mean, I was struck by maybe these 4 aspects of resilience. Is resilience a skill? Is it something to practice? I mean, can you comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. We really emphasize the sort of the utility of engaging with it with that mindset, that it is something that people can grow and develop intentionally. And we start by doing a little bit of an inventory about internal strengths and external resources to get people thinking about what they already do well, who are the social supports and the connections that they already have. And then usually when we're working internationally, we use the metaphor, it's an analogy and a metaphor, I guess, both kind of, about a tree, the idea of concept of a tree, of the ingredients of resilience. So the purpose is the fruit of the tree. What are you producing? What's your motivation? The adaptability is the trunk of the tree that's swaying in the storm. The connection that people need are the roots of the tree. That's what grounds you and gives you support, right? That's either, a single family member, pets, relationship with a higher power, with God, or a whole social network, right? And then hope. Eric and I have some differing opinions maybe, or ideas about what hope should represent in this example, but I use the example of hope being the moss that grows on the north side of the tree, where it's dark and cold, it thrives over there. And hope is always part of disaster recovery, even when things feel really, really bleak sometimes. So yeah, thinking of those ingredients as the tree really helps it stick kind of with people, but it is absolutely a tool or a set of tools that can be learned and developed.
I'm seeing Aaron's interesting question here about the evaluation data, Joe. I'm just going to go back. I think this is what he might have been. Oh, yeah, here it is. So why is the change from current practice so much higher for our Polish trainees than those who are being trained on interventions here at home using the same basic tool? I don't know what you think, Kira and Tony, but I do think that, the context of how to respond to a disaster such as war is going to be so different from the context of most trainings that we would have here at home, where folks who are skilled practitioners at something are getting a little bit of incremental help to perhaps be a little bit better at something through some evidence-based practice, versus the extraordinary circumstances in which folks were needing support that we were brought into. Do you all have any thoughts about this?
I think that's a really good point. And I do think when you go into a situation like this, it really is kind of a sea change, a cultural change in terms of practice. And so it does make a difference. It's that whole nother thing, as you point out, than just going to a training somewhere, getting your CEs.
Yeah, I agree. Even when we were talking, we were training the folks that were the Polish version of the crisis line, the people who answer the phones at the crisis line, they were like, we deal with crisis all the time, but not like this. This is a whole nother thing. And like we keep saying, it's a whole other thing. So yeah, I think it's even if it's people who are even doing crisis response, war and refugee disaster support is different.
Well, I guess before we wrap up, what's it like in general to do this kind of work? Are you sort of generally prepared to travel on short notice? Are there months when that works and doesn't work? What's it like to do this as part of a career?
Tricky.
Expensive and tricky.
I have 2 little ones, and this trip was very challenging for me as a mother with 2 young kids, because we were working with a lot of moms and kids, and it was definitely more challenging in that regard. But being prepared to have systems in place at home with your partner and your work and options to allow you to do that is essential for disaster support.
Yeah, it gets back to that personal preparedness. Well, what would you do if, you had to walk out the door in 24 hours and go respond to, an earthquake in California or whatever, certain things you have in place.
I see. Well, that's another area to train and perhaps develop expertise in for people with that interest and with that motivation. And I'm very glad that you had all agreed to present and inform this group. Like I mentioned, this is something that we put on our department website in the Grand Rounds recording, so others can watch in the future for information and to maybe get an interest in this area. And we're just at 1 o'clock here, so we'll need to end. But again, thank you very much for presenting. Also on short notice, by the way, I want to mention, this came together very quickly. Thank you.
Disaster response pace.
That's how we roll.
Thank you
Yeah,
for
it's
having
fine.
us.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.